Sometimes the walls that hold your pain are the same ones that protect your dreams. They called our home a cage made of dirt, laughed as if mud could never give birth to greatness. But what they didn't know was that every drop of rain that fell through our roof was shaping a fire inside me. A fire that would one day make the world remember the boy they once mocked. I grew up in a place where worth was measured by walls. The higher the bricks, the louder the respect. The rich lived in houses that shone with glass and iron gates, their laughter echoing across streets that people like us were never meant to walk on. And at the end of that long, uneven road stood our home, a humble mud house that leaned slightly to one side, its roof patched with palm leaves, its heart beating with love instead of wealth. My father built it with his bare hands. No cement, no machines, just sweat, calloused palms, and a determination I would only understand years later. My mother's hands shaped the walls smooth, singing old lullabies as the clay dried beneath the sun. To outsiders, it was nothing, a shack, a reminder of struggle. But to me, it was a living thing. It smelled of rain, firewood, and my father's quiet pride. It was the sound of laughter after hunger, the warmth of family when the world turned cold. But the world outside our walls didn't see that. They only saw what they wanted to mock. When I walked through the village, my clothes patched and faded, the children of the rich would whisper and laugh. "There goes the boy from the mud house," they'd say, their voices dripping with scorn. Sometimes they'd throw stones at our wall just to watch the cracks deepen. And each time, I wanted to scream, to fight, to prove that our home was more than mud. But my father would stop me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder, his voice steady. "Let them laugh, Aid," he'd say. "You can't stop the wind from blowing dust, but you can decide how clean you'll walk through it." He always said that with quiet strength, but even I could hear the fatigue hiding beneath his wisdom. Poverty teaches you to smile through exhaustion, to pretend your dignity isn't cracking like the walls around you. Still, my parents never complained. My mother worked long hours at the market, and every night she came home humming as though the world had been kind to her. My father repaired roofs, fixed fences, and helped others patch their homes, even the ones who mocked ours. That was the kind of man he was, a builder of peace in a world that respected only gold. The rains always came hardest to our side of the village. I remember one particular storm, the kind that darkened the sky by midday and roared like it was angry at the earth itself. The first drops hit our roof softly, like warning knocks, and then the heavens broke open. The roof began to leak in streams, water dripping into pots, pans, and our few cooking bowls. My mother rushed to catch the rain before it soaked our sleeping mats, her face tense but silent. My father climbed the roof barefoot, his silhouette framed against flashes of lightning, trying desperately to cover the holes with old sheets. The air smelled of fear and wet soil. I remember sitting near the wall, my heart pounding as thunder cracked the sky apart. Through a small hole in the roof, I saw my father battling the storm, and my mother kneeling beneath him, her hands clasped in prayer. In that moment, I felt something break inside me. Not anger, but something deeper, heavier. A question. Why must dignity always drown before the world decides to notice it? When the storm passed, silence followed. The kind of silence that carries defeat. My father came down, soaked to the bone, his body shaking from exhaustion. My mother lit a candle, its flame trembling in the draft. I watched her quietly wipe her tears, thinking I didn't see. She smiled when she noticed me, but her eyes were swollen with pain. I'd never seen her cry before. That night, I couldn't sleep. The walls that had always felt alive now felt like they were whispering my father's failures, my mother's quiet prayers, and my own helpless rage. As dawn crept in, I stepped outside, barefoot. The ground was still wet, the air heavy with the scent of mud and smoke. I stared at our little home, its walls stained darker, the roof sagging slightly. Yet somehow, it still stood. It had survived another storm, and in that survival, I saw a reflection of us, broken, but standing. My father came out and stood beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder, saying nothing. The silence between us was a promise. Neither of us had the words to speak. That morning, I made a vow I would never forget. I looked at the house that had held our pain and said silently, "I'll build you again someday. Stronger, higher, prouder. I'll make them see what you truly are." I didn't know how, but I knew I would. Because this house wasn't just mud, it was the proof that we existed, that we survived every storm thrown our way. That peace, the one built inside those walls, broke the day I saw my mother cry quietly as rain poured through our leaking roof. That single tear became my promise. I swore to the earth beneath my feet that no storm would ever find my family unprotected again. I didn't know then that the same mud that stained our hands would one day shape my crown, and that the laughter that haunted me would echo again, this time in applause. They said I was born from dust, as if that made me less human. But what they didn't understand was that dust remembers its maker. It carries the scent of creation, not shame. I learned early that when life buries you in dirt, it's not always to end you. Sometimes it's to plant you. And from the very ground they mocked, I promised myself I would rise. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove that mud, too, can grow. Miracles. The morning after my father's death, the world felt heavier, quieter, as if even the wind had forgotten how to breathe. The rain had passed, but its scent still clung to the earth, damp and cold. I sat outside our cracked house, watching the sun climb over the horizon, touching every roof except ours, as if light itself was ashamed to visit a home made of mud. My mother sat beside me, her face hollow but strong, eyes swollen from the night that refused to end. She didn't cry anymore. Her silence had become the language of survival. In that silence, something inside me shifted. The laughter of the rich boys, the cruel whispers of neighbors, the pitying eyes of teachers, all of it burned in my chest like coals. I realized that pity is a poison dressed as kindness. It doesn't heal you. It teaches you to stay small. And I refused to live small. I refused to be another name in the village's long list of forgotten poor. My father's words echoed in my mind, as clear as if he were still there beside me. If you can build a wall with mud, you can build a future with pain. At school, the divide between the rich and the rest was drawn in invisible lines. Lines you couldn't cross without feeling eyes follow you. My classmates carried polished shoes and clean hands, while mine were stained with the same earth that built our house. They didn't know that before coming to school, I helped my mother fetch water from a mile away, that my fingers were still sore from shaping clay to fix a leak, that my uniform smelled faintly of smoke because we dried it by the fire at night. They saw only the dirt, never the story. They laughed when I entered the classroom barefoot, their polished shoes tapping mockingly against the floor. I said nothing, but I watched them, not with anger, but with quiet patience. Every insult became a seed, and I buried each one deep inside me, feeding them with silence. My father once told me that silence can build or destroy, depending on what you plant in it. I decided to plant ambition. So, I worked. I studied by candlelight while others slept. I solved equations on the back of torn newspapers when I couldn't afford notebooks. I memorized lessons whispered by teachers I could barely hear over the noise of hunger. And slowly, the same children who mocked me began to notice. Their laughter turned to whispers. Their whispers turned to curiosity. I didn't speak to defend myself. I let my results do the talking. But even victory felt hollow when I returned home to see my mother working late into the night, sewing by the dim glow of a lantern, her hands trembling with fatigue. The walls of our house still wept when it rained, and each droplet that slipped through felt like the world reminding us of what we lacked. I wanted to fix everything, the leaks, the pain, the poverty. But all I had were dreams too big for a boy with calloused hands. Then one evening, I came home to find my mother, sitting by the door, holding my father's old scarf, the same one he wore every day. Her eyes were distant, as if she was seeing something I couldn't. "He worked so hard, Aid," she whispered, her voice breaking like a brittle branch. "He wanted you to have a life beyond this mud." I knelt beside her, taking her hands in mine, and in that moment I understood that grief is not just about losing someone. It's about inheriting their unfinished dreams. From that day on, I carried my father's dream like a burden and a blessing. Every morning, as the first light touched our walls, I whispered to myself that I would not let his struggle die in vain. I didn't want pity. I wanted purpose. I didn't want comfort. I wanted change. So I started selling firewood after school, saving coins so small they barely made a sound when dropped into my pocket. I saved not just for survival, but for a future I could not yet see. A future where no child would ever have to hide their hands, because they were covered in the same soil that gave them life. The day my father told me, "If you can build a wall with mud, you can build a future with pain," I didn't realize those would be his last words to me. That evening, his voice faded into the sound of rain, soft, endless, and final. But his words didn't die with him. They rooted themselves inside me. And from that moment, every insult, every tear, every grain of dust beneath my feet became part of the foundation of a vow that one day I'd build a life so strong, no storm could ever wash it away again. They say dreams fall from the sky, gifted to the lucky, the chosen, the privileged. But I learned early that dreams don't fall from anywhere. They grow from the dirt beneath your feet, watered by sweat, pain, and persistence. And I had plenty of dirt on my hands, my clothes, my name. Every grain of it carried my father's voice. Every step across that muddy ground whispered one truth. The same soil that buried my childhood would one day grow my destiny. After my father's death, I became the man of a house made of mud and silence. Each morning, I woke before dawn to help my mother fetch water from the stream, our shadows long and quiet against the early light. The weight of the buckets hurt my shoulders, but the weight of our reality hurt far more. When I wasn't in school, I worked on nearby farms, bent under the heat of the African sun, carrying baskets heavier than my small frame could bear. I would look at the farmers around me, men older, worn, their dreams buried beneath years of survival, and I would whisper to myself, "This is not the end of my story." While others saw me as a poor boy chasing illusions, I saw every hardship as an investment. The coins I earned, small, rusted, barely enough to buy a meal, I saved. Each one found its way into a dented tin box under my bed, wrapped in old newspaper, hidden like a secret prayer. I called it my father's fund, though he'd never touched a single coin inside it. It was my way of keeping his promise alive, of proving that mud could still birth miracles. At school, I studied until my eyes blurred. At night, when my classmates slept, I sat under a flickering lantern, tracing words on torn pages, repeating lessons out loud to the rhythm of crickets outside. But even that wasn't enough. So, when I heard about adult night school in the next village, a place where laborers learned by candlelight after long days in the fields, I decided to join. The laughter started immediately. "You think you'll become a big man by writing ABC in the dark," they said. "Dreams don't feed you, Aid." Even my friends tried to stop me, but I'd stopped living for their approval long ago. I didn't care if they called me foolish. I was already too familiar with ridicule to fear it anymore. That small classroom became my sanctuary. The benches were cracked, the chalk dull, the roof leaked when it rained. But inside those broken walls, my mind was free. I listened to every word the teacher spoke, as if he were revealing secrets buried in the soil itself. Knowledge became my rebellion, my quiet uprising against the destiny the world had chosen for me. I began to believe that poverty wasn't inherited. It was escaped, one idea at a time. The more I learned, the less I envied the rich, because while they had comfort, I had clarity, the understanding that ignorance is the heaviest chain a man can wear, and laughter from others is just noise trying to keep you from breaking it. Months turned into years. I worked through heat, through hunger, through exhaustion so deep it made the stars blur. But I never stopped. Every step on those muddy roads reminded me where I came from, and every lesson reminded me where I was going. Then, one evening, while returning from the fields, I saw the postman standing at our gate, a rare sight in our forgotten corner of the world. In his hand was an envelope with my name scrawled across it in official ink. My mother's eyes filled with tears before I even opened it. My hands trembled as I tore it open, and when I read the words inside, I felt the ground shift beneath me. It was a scholarship, full tuition, books, and travel. I couldn't breathe. The same boy they called Mud Child had earned his way into the city's biggest college. I ran barefoot down the muddy roads they once mocked me on, laughter mixing with tears, my heart pounding with disbelief. But what I didn't know then was that every road to success begins with rain. And this letter wasn't the end of my struggle. It was the beginning of a storm far greater than any I had ever faced. They say cities shine brightest from afar because distance hides their truth. From the village hills, the city glowed like gold, a promise glittering against the horizon, a whisper that said, "Come and be more." But when I finally arrived, I learned that gold from afar is often just rust up close. The city didn't welcome dreamers. It fed on them, swallowed them whole, and spat them out nameless. Yet, I had come too far to be devoured without a fight. The day I left my village, my mother wrapped my lunch in old newspaper and tied it in a faded cloth. She didn't cry. She simply placed her hands on my head and said, "The world outside doesn't pity men like us, Aid. Whatever you do, don't kneel for kindness. Stand for your name." Her voice trembled only once, and I carried that sound with me all the way to the bus station. The bus ride to the city was long and unforgiving. The road stretched endlessly through dry plains, each mile carrying me further from everything familiar: the scent of wet earth, the rhythm of crickets, the warmth of home. When the skyline finally appeared, my heart raced. Towers rose like giants, windows shimmering beneath the sun, cars honking in languages I hadn't yet learned. I stepped off that bus feeling small but determined, clutching my bag. My life folded into one worn piece of luggage, but dreams in the city don't wait for you. They test you. My scholarship got me into school, but not into comfort. Tuition was covered, yes, but food, transport, and shelter were mine to find. I worked wherever work appeared, carrying bricks at construction sites, washing dishes in roadside canteens, cleaning gutters when the rains flooded the streets. I slept in unfinished buildings, curled beside my bag, using my jacket as a pillow. The nights were cold, and the city's silence was not peace, it was indifference. Each morning, I'd walk past offices with glass walls and men in pressed suits, watching them sip coffee behind locked gates. I would tell myself, one day, I'll walk through those gates, not as a cleaner, but as an equal. It was the same sentence I repeated every night, my voice hoarse but unbroken. "Don't let them be right about you," I whispered into the darkness. "Don't let them be right." But the city had ways of testing faith. Hunger made me humble. Rejection made me numb. There were days when I went to class on an empty stomach, my hands shaking as I took notes I could barely focus on. My shoes wore thin, my shirt faded, and people began to look through me the way the rich look at shadows. Still, I kept going, because stopping meant letting them win. One evening, after a long day of work, I passed by a government building where a man was arguing with a guard about a missing janitor. Something inside me made me pause. "I can do it," I said, stepping forward. The guard laughed at first, until I showed him how neatly I could clean. He shrugged, handed me a mop, and pointed toward the glass doors. That night, as the lights flickered on and the corridors emptied, I walked through marble halls I had only ever seen in newspapers. The air smelled of polish and power. I mopped the floors. In silence, the reflection of my face sliding across tiles that men of influence walked on daily. It was humbling and haunting all at once, to be surrounded by wealth, yet belong nowhere within it. Then, as I turned a corner, my mop clattered against a door I hadn't noticed before, a large wooden one with gold handles. The plaque read, "Mayor's Office." For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the nameplate as if it were a portal to another world. Curiosity tugged at me. I knew I had no right to enter, but something stronger than reason, maybe fate, maybe hunger, made me push the door open just an inch. Inside, the office glowed under warm lamplight. Papers were stacked neatly on a mahogany desk, and portraits of past leaders lined the walls. It smelled of success, of something earned or inherited, I couldn't yet tell. My reflection stared back at me from the polished floor, and for the first time, I saw what I wanted to become. Not the janitor with a mop, but the man sitting behind that desk. Just then, footsteps echoed down the hall. My heart jumped. I scrambled back, gripping the mop tightly, pretending to scrub. The door opened, and the mayor himself walked in. Tall, suited, confident. He looked at me once, then at the half-cleaned floor, and nodded. "Finish up quickly," he said. "A man's work is judged by his patience, not his pay." His words struck me harder than any insult ever had. There was no mockery in his tone, only truth. I bowed slightly, and as he left, a strange realization settled over me. Sometimes the lowest place in the room gives you the clearest view of the top. From that night on, I cleaned those marble floors as though I owned them. Every sweep of the mop was a silent vow. I didn't know it then, but fate had already chosen that room for me. Because years later, I would walk back into that same office, not as the boy with the mop, but as the man they would one day call Mr. Mayor. They say the truth will set you free, but what they never tell you is that freedom often comes after fire. Truth doesn't open doors, it burns them down. And when the smoke clears, you find yourself standing alone among the ashes, wondering if honesty was worth the price it demanded. I learned that the hard way, the day I chose to speak, and the world chose to silence me. The morning I exposed the scandal, the sun rose brighter than usual, almost mocking in its warmth. I remember standing before the press, my hands trembling, but my voice steady. The evidence I had gathered, those notes written in secret between mop strokes and midnight whispers, now lay spread before the cameras. I didn't speak like a janitor. I spoke like a man who had seen too much to stay quiet. I named names, revealed numbers, and tore open the veil of power that had hidden corruption for years. For a few moments, I felt the city's pulse change. People listened. Some even applauded. Headlines flashed. Microphones followed. And for the first time, my truth had weight. But truth is a storm. It doesn't end where you expect it to. By evening, the same faces that had smiled at me in the morning twisted into masks of denial. "He's lying," they said. A bitter dropout seeking attention. The men I had exposed closed ranks, their wealth buying silence faster than I could buy bread. Within days, my scholarship was revoked. The school claimed I had violated institutional integrity. My dorm room was emptied, my belongings tossed out like trash. Employers turned me away before I could even explain my name. Whispers followed me like shadows. That's the boy who bit the hand that fed him. Truth, I realized, doesn't make you noble in a world built on deception. It makes you disposable. The city that once felt like promise now looked like punishment. I wandered its streets, hungry and invisible, my dreams folded into the same bag I had arrived with years ago. The nights grew longer, the silence heavier. And in that loneliness, I almost wished I had stayed quiet. Almost. Then, one evening, as I sat beneath a flickering streetlight, I remembered my mother's words, the ones she had spoken when I first left home. "Let them bury you, son. Seeds grow better underground." I closed my eyes and realized she had been right all along. I wasn't finished. I was being planted. So, I picked up my bag and began walking, away from the city that chewed me up, back toward the village that once laughed at me. When I reached the old mud house, its cracks glowing under the moonlight, I didn't see failure. I saw the foundation. That night, sitting on the same ground where my story began, I made a vow. I would rebuild, not from bricks or power, but from purpose. And one day, the world that cast me out would have no choice but to listen again. They say broken things have no value, but sometimes it's from the shattered pieces that the strongest foundations are built. When I returned to my village, I had nothing left but calloused hands and a heart full of stubborn hope. I didn't come back to prove anyone wrong. I came back to prove that starting over is not the same as failing. Sometimes, to build a future, you have to start with broken things. And I was one of them. The first few weeks back home were quiet. Too quiet. The same people who once mocked me now watched from a distance, their laughter replaced by whispers. The mud house still stood, cracked and weathered, its walls scarred by years of rain and memory. I slept on the same floor where I'd once dreamed of escaping, only this time, I didn't hate it. That house had witnessed my hunger, my tears, my beginnings, and now it would witness my rebuilding. I started small. Each morning, I gathered the children who roamed the village aimlessly, their hands idle, their eyes dull with the same hopelessness I had once known. I began teaching them under the shade of the old baobab tree near the stream. I had no chalkboard, no desks, just a few worn books I'd carried back from the city, the same books I once begged others to lend me. I taught them the alphabet, numbers, and stories about courage. But more than that, I taught them belief, the kind that doesn't need permission to exist. Word began to spread slowly. A mother sent her son, then another sent her daughter. By the third week, there were 15 children sitting in the dust, their faces lit with curiosity. When the first well dried up, I didn't wait for help that never came. I dug another. My palms bled, my back ached, but water came again, clear and cold. That day, the village began to look at me differently. I didn't build walls this time. I built trust. I helped repair roofs, taught farmers how to read contracts so no one could cheat them again, and organized small meetings about saving and community farming. What began as survival turned into something larger, something sacred. The mud house that once symbolized poverty became the center of our rebuilding. Its walls, patched with new clay and painted with handprints of children, no longer looked weak. They looked alive. The laughter that once mocked me had faded. Now, when people passed, they nodded. Some even stopped to help. Respect doesn't come from money or titles. It comes when your actions start healing what others have broken. And little by little, that's what began to happen in our village. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the children's laughter echoed through the yard, a woman appeared at the gate. She carried a camera and a notepad, her expression curious but kind. "Are you the man who teaches under the tree?" she asked. I nodded, unsure what to say. She smiled softly and replied, "Good. I've come to write about the man who builds with hope." And in that moment, standing in front of the same mud walls that once drew ridicule, I realized the world had finally come back, not to laugh, but to listen. They say words can't build walls, But when the right story meets the right struggle, it becomes a revolution. I never meant to start one. All I did was rebuild what the world had broken, but somehow the world started to notice. The same mud house they once mocked had become a symbol, not of poverty, but of possibility. And for the first time in my life, people didn't just see where I lived. They saw what I stood for. The journalist's article was published on a quiet Sunday morning. By evening, it had spread across the nation like wildfire. Headlines called me "The Boy Who Built Hope from Mud." Pictures of the children learning under the tree, of the patched walls of my house, of me standing barefoot with a spade in hand. They went everywhere. Radios told my story. Television shows discussed it. My phone, once silent, wouldn't stop ringing. At first I didn't believe it. How could something so ordinary, my life, my pain, my persistence, suddenly matter to millions? But people came. Some brought donations, others brought books, seeds, tools. Volunteers arrived from nearby towns, eager to help repair roads, dig wells, and teach classes. The laughter of children became the anthem of our mornings. The sound of hammers and songs filled the air by evening. For the first time, the village that once hid from shame began to stand tall. We built a small school beside the baobab tree, the same place where it all began. Its walls were made of red clay and reinforced with hope. Every classroom had a name: faith, courage, resilience. Soon after, we rebuilt the bridge that connected our village to the main road, then started a community garden where no one went hungry again. Life didn't just return. It blossomed, but with recognition came a new kind of test. The same politicians who once ignored my letters and dismissed my ideas now came smiling, cameras in tow. They shook my hand, praised my vision, and promised partnerships. I could see it in their eyes. They didn't come to help. They came to harvest what I had planted. Fame has a strange way of attracting both light and shadow, and I could feel the shadows growing longer. One morning, as I stepped outside to meet a group of visiting donors, I saw something that stopped me cold. A large white banner fluttered above the crowd, bold red letters painted across it. "Run for mayor, the man who builds with hope." The people were chanting, smiling, clapping, their voices rising with a kind of faith I had never seen before. My throat tightened. I looked back at the mud house, my first classroom, my sanctuary, my beginning. It stood firm, proud, as though reminding me where I came from. At that moment, I understood this was no longer just about rebuilding walls or teaching children. This was about rebuilding a nation's belief in itself. The mud house that once made me a target of ridicule was now my campaign headquarters. As the crowd chanted my name, one truth echoed louder than them all. I had spent my life building with my hands. Now it was time to lead with my heart. They say politics is a game of power, but I learned it's really a test of endurance. A battlefield where truth bleeds first. Promises are easy to speak. It's the people who believe in them that pay the price. When I stepped into that arena, I didn't bring wealth. I didn't bring status. I brought scars. Because politics isn't about promises. It's about who bleeds for them. The day I announced my candidacy, the town square overflowed. Farmers came with dust on their feet, mothers with babies on their backs, children waving flags made from old fabric, stitched with my name. The same faces that once mocked the mud house now stood shoulder to shoulder, chanting, "Hope doesn't wear a suit." It was more than a campaign. It was a revolution disguised as faith. My opponents were powerful men, wealthy, educated abroad, with ties to the same system I had once exposed. They arrived at rallies in tinted SUVs, their speeches crafted by professionals. Mine were written by the calloused hands of people who had nothing left to lose. They laughed at me on television. "A mud boy," one of them said, smirking, "can't lead a city built of glass." I smiled when I heard it, because glass shatters, mud endures. I walked from market to market, shaking hands that politicians had long forgotten. I spoke of clean water, fair schools, roofs that didn't leak when it rained. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. I reminded people of promises that had already been broken. I told them that the measure of a leader wasn't how clean his shoes were, but how dirty his hands got fixing what others ignored. My campaign team wasn't made of strategists. It was made of believers. The schoolteacher who once studied under my tree became my secretary. The old farmer who'd given me his last yam became my treasurer. My campaign poster was printed on reused paper, my microphone was borrowed from the village choir, and my office, my campaign headquarters, was still the same mud house where everything had begun. At night, when the chants faded and the crowd dispersed, I sat alone in that house, surrounded by silence and memory. I would trace the cracks on the wall with my fingers, each one a reminder of where I'd come from. Some nights, fear would creep in, fear of losing, fear of failing the very people who believed I was their voice. But then I'd look at the small wooden frame on my desk, my mother's picture, and her eyes seemed to whisper, "Let them laugh again, son. You know how to turn their laughter into bricks." The weeks leading to the election were chaos. My speeches drew crowds larger than any politician had seen in years. The media called it the Mud Movement. But success brings enemies. Anonymous letters appeared under my door. Threats, bribes disguised as offers of peace. "Withdraw from the race," they said, "and we'll make you comfortable." I burned the letters one by one. Comfort had never built anything worth keeping. Then, the night before the election, the sky turned red. I was walking home from the final rally when I saw it. Smoke rising from the hill where my house stood. People screamed my name as they ran toward me, their faces painted with panic. I broke into a sprint, my heart pounding louder than my steps. By the time I reached it, flames were devouring everything. The books, the table, the walls I had rebuilt with my own hands. The air smelled of ashes and betrayal. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, watching the fire consume my past. The villagers gathered around me, their faces lit by the flickering glow. Some wept, some shouted curses into the night. One of the children tugged at my sleeve and whispered, "Uncle Aid, where will we learn now?" I looked down at him, his face smeared with soot, his eyes full of faith. And I realized something powerful. They could burn my shelter, but they couldn't burn my home. Because my home wasn't made of walls. It was made of people, of purpose, of persistence. As dawn approached, the fire finally died, leaving behind nothing but ash and the faint outline of what once was. I stood there barefoot in the soot, my heart beating steady, my resolve unbroken. The flames had taken my house, but they had given me something else. Clarity. This wasn't destruction. It was baptism. When the sun rose that morning, painting the ashes gold, I made a silent promise to the wind. They could burn my walls, but they would never burn my will. Tomorrow I will walk into that election not as a man seeking victory, but as one already reborn. They say fire destroys, but that night, when my mud house burned to the ground, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like a beginning written in smoke. The flames that devoured my past lit up the sky above the city, and for the first time, people didn't just see the fire, they saw what it revealed. The night my house burned down was the night the city found its light. The election came like a storm, fierce and unpredictable. Rumors swirled, opponents spread lies, and newspapers debated whether a mud boy could truly govern a modern city. But when the final votes were counted, the noise fell silent. I had won, not by a margin, but by a landslide so wide, it silenced doubt itself. The laughter that had once followed me since childhood turned into applause, and the people who once called my walls dirty now called my name with pride. That night, As I stood on the podium in the city square, the air thick with chants and tears, I looked out over a sea of faces, faces that carried the weight of struggle and the hope of something better. I saw mothers holding babies, farmers with cracked palms raised high, students waving hand-painted signs. It wasn't my victory alone. It was theirs. It belonged to every person who had ever been told they were too small to matter. When they handed me the microphone, the noise faded. My voice trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer enormity of the moment. "I stand before you," I began, "not as a man born from privilege, but as one built from perseverance. You called me the boy from the mud. And yes, I am. Because mud is what the earth gives you when you have nothing left. And from that, I built everything you see today." The crowd roared, but I didn't raise my hands to celebrate. I raised them to remind them. "This victory," I said, "is not about me. It's about every child who studies by candlelight, every mother who prays for rain, every man who still believes that dignity should not be a luxury." I took my oath the next morning in the open square, not behind closed doors. I wanted the people to see that power didn't belong to politicians. It belonged to those who had carried me here. My words were simple. I will lead with the same hands that once built walls of mud, and I will never forget the dirt that shaped me. My first act as mayor wasn't to build monuments or cut ribbons. I rebuilt the school, the well, and the bridge, the same ones that had taught me what true leadership meant. I raised teachers' salaries, introduced free meals for children, and created a fund for struggling farmers. But as the applause grew louder, so did the weight on my shoulders. Leadership, I learned, isn't about victory. It's about vigilance. Every decision carried consequences. Every promise carried pressure. I no longer fought for survival. I fought for souls. The same people who once celebrated my rise now watched every step I took, expecting miracles from a man who was still learning how to breathe in the thin air of power. Some nights, I would return to the place where my mud house once stood. The ground there still smelled faintly of ash, but I had left it untouched. I wanted to remember. I wanted to remind myself that from those ashes I had risen, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a servant of will. But even as I sat in the mayor's office, with polished floors beneath my feet, and my name engraved on a golden plate, I felt something stirring in the air. The faint, uneasy whisper of politics. The same people who once doubted me were now eager to control me. Power, I realized, doesn't change people. It reveals them. And the fire that had burned my home was nothing compared to the fire waiting inside these walls of marble and glass. As I sat in the mayor's chair for the first time, the cheers outside faded into silence. Papers stacked high before me, each one a decision that could heal or hurt, build or break. I stared at my hands, the same hands that once dug through mud to save a dying crop, and wondered if they were strong enough to dig through corruption too. Leadership wasn't victory, it was responsibility. And in that moment, I understood. I hadn't reached the top. I had only reached the beginning of another climb. They say power doesn't change a man. It reveals him. But I learned that once you sit in the chair of leadership, temptation doesn't come dressed as evil. It comes smiling, with golden promises and polished shoes. Every leader faces two choices: to serve the people or to serve himself. And the day I had to choose, the weight of my own past became heavier than any crown. At first, the mayor's office felt like a dream. Polished floors, clean air, and endless visitors offering congratulations. But soon the congratulations turned into offers. Every handshake carried an invisible price. Every smile hid a secret agreement. Men who had once mocked me now called me Your Excellency. They brought fine suits, expensive watches, and envelopes thicker than honesty. They spoke in whispers, not of service, but of profit. of favors that would make me rich beyond my childhood imagination. I remembered the janitor I once was, sweeping these same halls, listening to those same whispers from behind marble doors. Back then, I thought corruption was a monster that lived in the shadows. Now I understood. It doesn't hide in the dark. It sits in daylight, wearing perfume and calling itself opportunity. My first test came quietly. A contractor approached me with a smile too polished to trust. He offered to rebuild the city's bridges at twice the real cost and promised a gift for my cooperation. His words were coated in respect, but they reeked of decay. I looked him in the eye and said softly, "The bridge you're building, make sure it can hold the weight of your conscience." He never came back, but others did. Dozens. Some used charm, others used threats. My advisors warned me, "You can't fight the system alone. Play along, just a little, so you can survive long enough to do good." Their logic was sharp, but my soul resisted. Because I knew, the moment you drink from a poisoned cup, you can't call it water anymore. I made enemies among friends. Men I'd shared dreams with turned cold when I refused their hidden deals. My name appeared in newspapers again. This time, not as the boy who built hope, but as the mayor who refuses to play the game. They mocked me, isolated me, tried to paint me as stubborn, naive, unfit for politics. But I wasn't fighting for headlines. I was fighting for the boy I used to be. The barefoot dreamer who believed integrity was worth more than gold. Still, the nights grew lonelier. There were moments when the silence in my office felt heavier than the city itself. I would walk to the window, looking out at the lights stretching beyond the horizon. The same city that had once laughed at my mud house, now under my care. Power is a strange kind of hunger. It feeds you until you forget what you were starving for. I feared that hunger more than I feared defeat. Then came the audit, a trap set by my rivals. They accused me of hiding money, of stealing funds from the people I had sworn to serve. They raided my home, searched my accounts, tore through my records. But they found nothing. Every coin I'd earned was accounted for. My enemies failed, but not before planting doubt in the hearts of some who once believed in me. It hurt more than any insult. I realized that doing good was easy when you were powerless. The real challenge was staying good when the world handed you everything it once denied. Exhausted, I took a trip back to my village one evening, seeking silence, maybe forgiveness. The stars were bright, the night warm with the scent of rain-soaked earth. As I walked toward the place where my mud house once stood, I saw it. The rebuilt wall, smooth and strong, standing proud against the wind. I ran my hand across it, feeling the rough clay against my skin, the same texture that once carried my entire childhood. And then I saw him. A small boy, no older than I was when it all began. He was curled beside the wall, barefoot, his schoolbooks tucked beneath his head like a pillow. His chest rose and fell softly with sleep. I crouched beside him, brushing the dust from his cheek. In his tiny, clenched fist was a piece of paper, a drawing. It showed a house, a tree, and a man standing tall beside it. Me. For a long moment I couldn't move. The past, the present, and everything I had fought for collapsed into one truth. The world doesn't change when you gain power. It changes when someone, somewhere, dares to dream of becoming better than what they were given. As I stood there under the stars, watching that boy sleep beside my old wall, a quiet realization sank deep into my soul. I had spent my life trying to build a world worth living in. But the true test of leadership wasn't what I built. It was whether those who came after me would dare to dream higher. And in that child's peaceful face, I saw not my legacy, but my reminder. I used to think success was gold, something that glittered, something that demanded to be seen. But as years passed, I realized true success is clay shaped by struggle, patience, and pain. molded by the same hands that once trembled in poverty. Gold shines in sunlight, clay endures every storm, and I had been shaped by storms more than anything else. When my term as mayor ended, the city stood taller, not because of monuments or policies, but because hope had become contagious. Roads were smoother, schools were fuller, wells never ran dry. Yet despite all the achievements, my heart longed for something simpler. The place where it all began was I returned home. The road to my village had changed. The dirt path was now paved, lined with young trees that whispered in the wind. Children ran beside my car, laughing, shouting my name, not with mockery, but with pride. When I stepped out, the air smelled of wet earth and roasted maize, and for a moment it felt like time had folded into itself, the past reaching out to shake hands with the present. And there it stood, my mud house, rebuilt, restored, and reborn. It wasn't grand or decorated. It didn't need to be. Its walls glowed warmly under the sunset, smooth yet still bearing the faint texture of the earth that birthed it. Visitors from across the nation had begun calling it the house that raised a mayor. Reporters wrote stories about it, schools brought students to see it, and elders from neighboring towns came to touch its walls like pilgrims at a shrine of perseverance. But to me, it was still home, not because it stood, but because it had endured. I walked slowly around it, my fingers tracing the clay. Every curve, every crack, every grain of earth carried a memory. I felt my father's calloused hands in the hardened ridges of the wall. I heard my mother's quiet prayers in the way the breeze hummed through the open window. In that moment, I understood what they had both been trying to teach me all along, that a man's worth isn't measured by what he builds for himself, but by what survives when he's gone. I stepped inside, and everything felt both smaller and larger than I remembered. Smaller because I had grown, larger because it now held the weight of every story that had shaped me. The wooden table where my mother once served yam porridge still stood, polished and cared for. A picture of my father hung above it, his eyes stern yet kind, as though still watching, still guiding. A group of schoolchildren entered with their teacher, their curious eyes wide. One of them asked, "Sir, is it true you used to live here?" I smiled, crouching to meet their gaze. "Yes," I said softly. "This is where I learned that mud doesn't just build houses. It builds hearts." They looked around, whispering among themselves as their teacher smiled. "And now," I added, "this house belongs to all of you, because greatness doesn't start in palaces. It starts right here, in places the world forgets." When they left, I sat by the doorway, watching the evening light spill across the floor. My shadow fell long against the wall, and I thought of the boy I used to be, barefoot, hungry, yet burning with impossible dreams. I thought of the laughter that had followed me through the years, the insults that had once cut deep, the doubts that had tried to bury me. And I smiled, because every insult had been a brick, every doubt, a foundation, every failure, a teacher. Success hadn't lifted me out of the mud. It had led me back to it, to remind me that nothing beautiful grows without roots buried deep in struggle. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood beneath the same roof that once leaked on my childhood dreams, the air thick with the scent of memory and rain. I ran my hand across the wall one last time and whispered, "You laughed at my mud house, but it was the foundation that taught me how to rise." The wind carried my words away, softly, like a prayer returning home. And in that quiet moment, I finally understood. The mud didn't just make my house. It made me. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that greatness can rise from the ground. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated only to prove them wrong? Your story might inspire someone else today. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss another story of hope, struggle, and redemption. Because here, every story starts with pain, but ends